The biting wind howled through the dense pines of the Wyoming wilderness, its icy breath cutting through even the thickest of layers. Snowflakes danced erratically in the gusts, colliding and merging into a vast white curtain that blanketed the mountains. It was the kind of cold that didn't just seep into your skin, but pierced straight into your bones. Yet, amidst this desolate beauty, one figure stood firm against the elements, his silhouette a dark blot against the brilliance of the snow. Robert Stokes adjusted his woolen cap, pulling it lower over his forehead as he trudged through the knee-deep snow. His breath puffed out in clouds, immediately swept away by the relentless wind. The rifle slung over his shoulder and the trapline in his hand were his constant companions, tools of a life he'd chosen deliberately. Life out here was solitary, unforgiving, and raw, just the way Robert preferred it. He'd lived in the wilderness for nearly a decade, retreating from a world he no longer recognized. The noise, the chaos, the betrayals of a life once filled with people, it had all driven him to seek solace in the untamed wild. Here, surrounded by towering trees and snow-covered peaks, Robert had found a kind of peace, or so he told himself. His cabin stood at the edge of a frozen lake, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone that bore the scars of many winters. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a rare sign of warmth in an otherwise icy expanse. Inside, the cabin was a testament to Robert's resourcefulness. Shelves lined with jars of preserves, a wood-burning stove at the center, and walls adorned with tools and traps. It was a space built for function, not comfort. As he approached the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow, Robert's gaze swept across the clearing. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and today, something felt off. The forest, usually alive with the faint rustle of animals and the distant calls of birds, was eerily silent. Even the wind, for all its fury, seemed unable to drown out the oppressive quiet. Robert shook off the unease as he stepped inside, the warmth from the stove immediately wrapping around him. He set down his gear and stoked the fire, adding another log to the flames. The flickering light cast long shadows across the room, making the small space feel even smaller. He settled into his worn armchair, a cup of strong black coffee in hand. His eyes drifted to the window, where snow piled higher with each passing hour. The isolation had its challenges, but it was better than the alternative. Out here, there were no complicated relationships, no betrayals, no expectations, just him and the land. And yet, as the storm outside intensified, Robert couldn't shake the gnawing emptiness that had begun creeping in over the past few months. It was subtle at first, a fleeting thought, a momentary ache, but it had grown, becoming harder to ignore. The wilderness, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls of the cabin, once comforting, now seemed to close in on him. The cold air outside was bone-chilling, and Robert could feel the weight of the mountain's isolation pressing down on him as he stood by the window, watching the landscape stretch before him. The unforgiving winds of this remote region seemed to echo a warning, as though nature itself was trying to assert its dominance over the fragile human presence in its midst. His little cottage on the edge of the Wyoming wilderness felt small against the backdrop of the towering peaks, their snow-capped faces towering like silent sentinels. He'd always been a solitary man, his life shaped by the rugged, quiet beauty of the land he had chosen to call home. Yet, as he stood there, looking out into the icy world beyond, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss today. It was as if the very land was holding its breath. The wind howled through the trees, whipping up snow and scattering it across the frozen ground, creating a shimmering curtain of white. Robert watched, as he always did, but today was different. The silence of the winter morning, usually so peaceful, now felt unnervingly heavy. A soft sound, almost like a tap, caught his attention. He turned toward the sound, which was faint but unmistakable. His breath caught in his chest as he saw it, a large shadow moving against the frosted glass of the window. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a bear looking for food, but then the shape grew clearer. It wasn't a mere bear. It was something much more purposeful, much more deliberate. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he peered closer. There, standing just beyond the window, was a massive grizzly bear, her fur coated in frost, her massive frame looming against the glass. But what struck Robert wasn't just the bear's imposing size or the chilling cold that radiated from the scene, it was the behavior of the animal itself. The grizzly wasn't trying to break in or snatch food. No, instead, she was tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic, deliberate sound echoed through the silence, and Robert's eyes widened as the realization hit him. This bear wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was as if she were trying to communicate, to ask for something. And behind her, huddled together in the snow, were her cubs. Robert could see their tiny forms, shaking violently in the brutal cold. One of the cubs stumbled and fell, collapsing onto the snow, its small body barely moving. The sight of the helpless cub struck Robert like a punch to the gut. The instincts of a man who had lived in this wilderness his whole life screamed at him to turn away, to leave the wild to its own devices. But the bear's actions kept him rooted to the spot. She didn't growl or roar. She didn't make any aggressive move. Instead, she rushed to her fallen cub, gently lifting it with her powerful jaws, and returned to the window. What happened next was impossible to ignore. The bear, with the smallest cub in her mouth, pressed the little creature against the glass. As she did so, she looked into Robert's eyes filled with an intelligence and desperation that made his blood run cold. The air seemed to freeze even more, the temperature plummeting further as the storm intensified. Yet Robert stood there, unable to look away. He had always believed animals acted solely on instinct, driven by the cold and hunger. But the bear's actions seemed too deliberate, too purposeful, to be the work of mere instinct. It was as if the bear, a creature of nature's harshest forces, was asking for help. Desperation emanated from her every movement, and Robert could see the chilling truth in her eyes. The small cub's condition was deteriorating, its tiny body shaking uncontrollably, its breath shallow and weak. It wasn't just the cub's condition that struck Robert, it was the sheer hopelessness in the mother bear's eyes. Her movements grew more frantic as she alternated between checking on her cubs and returning to the window. It was as if she was trying to communicate, pleading with him to understand the dire situation. But there was no way to make sense of what was happening. This was no ordinary bear. No wild creature would display such understanding, such an attempt to communicate with a human. And yet, here it was, unfolding before him. The bear's next move sent chills down Robert's spine. She sat back on her haunches, then slowly raised both of her massive paws in a motion that was eerily human, a gesture that seemed almost like a prayer. She held them there, her eyes locked onto Robert's face, as though silently begging for help. The sight was almost too much to bear, and Robert felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the bear's desperate plea. The world outside seemed to vanish as time itself slowed down. Robert's heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the wind howled louder and the cold seeped deeper into his bones. But his attention remained fixed on the grizzly, whose eyes never left his. She held that gaze for what felt like an eternity, and Robert, unable to look away, felt something stirring within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a deep, instinctual pull, a need to help. Before he could act, a soft sound broke through the tension, a faint whimper from the other cubs. The middle cub, barely able to stand, collapsed onto the snow, its body too weak to hold itself up. The smallest cub, which had been so still in the mother's mouth, now lay motionless in the snow, the telltale signs of hypothermia unmistakable. The mother bear's gaze never wavered, her desperation growing more evident with each passing moment. She gathered the two fallen cubs in her paws, pulling them close to her chest in an effort to warm them. Her eyes never left Robert, pleading for understanding, for mercy. Each motion seemed carefully planned, almost as if the bear was trying to communicate a message, one that no human could easily decipher, but one that was unmistakably clear. The bear needed help. The air was thick with tension as the storm continued to rage outside, but Robert stood frozen in his place. The bear's desperation was overwhelming, and it became clear that her actions were not those of a simple wild animal seeking food. This was something different, something deeper. The bear's next actions only deepened the mystery. She began to scrape the frost from the window with her paw, as if trying to communicate through the glass. The marks she made were precise, deliberate, almost like attempts at writing, at forming symbols. Robert's mind raced, but the answer eluded him. Could this bear be trying to tell him something? Was she truly attempting to communicate with him? For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Robert could hear only the wind howling, the pounding of his own heart in his ears, and the rhythmic scratching of the bear's paws against the window. The bond between them was growing stronger, deeper, and yet Robert didn't know what to do. The cubs, weakened and vulnerable, looked up at their mother, their tiny faces contorted in confusion, their bodies too cold to move. The mother bear's movements grew more frantic, more desperate. She alternated between pressing the cubs against the glass and making marks on the window, each action more deliberate than the last. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, there was nothing more pressing, nothing more important than what was happening in front of Robert's eyes. Her actions screamed of a mother's love, a love that transcended the wild instincts that governed her every move. She wasn't just an animal in survival mode. No, this bear was a mother, fighting against the elements to save her children. And for the first time in his life, Robert found himself wondering if he, too, might be able to help. Robert stood motionless, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. He had always known the wilderness to be a place of unforgiving beauty, a place where survival was the ultimate law. Yet, here he was, staring out at a mother grizzly who, against all logic, was asking for his help. Her powerful eyes, filled with fear, desperation, and an almost human understanding, locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. The storm outside raged on, the snow swirling in thick, angry gusts that obliterated his view of the mountains beyond. The wind howled through the cracks in his cabin, but Robert could no longer hear it. All that mattered was the bear and her cubs. The sight of them, weak and trembling in the snow, had shaken something deep inside him, a primal instinct to protect, to save. He wasn't a man of sentimentality. In fact, he prided himself on his pragmatism, his ability to maintain a hard distance from the world. He had chosen this life out here for a reason rooted in isolation, in the desire to be left alone, away from the complications of human society. Yet, as he watched the bear's desperate gestures through the frost-covered window, he realized that the world had a way of reaching into your heart when you least expected it, dragging out the parts of you that you thought were long buried. The idea of helping a wild animal, let alone a bear, seemed absurd. No one in their right mind would ever try to intervene with nature. The wilderness had its own rules, and those who ignored them were often punished. Robert had witnessed that firsthand, but something about this situation was different. It wasn't just any bear, it was a mother, and that changed everything. The bear's paws continued to scrape at the window, as if urging him to act. She had already communicated the danger her cubs were in, but what she didn't know, what neither of them could fully understand in this frozen moment, was how Robert was supposed to help. The practical side of his mind screamed for him to stay inside, to lock the door and let nature take its course. After all, what could one man do against the forces of the wilderness? But the emotional side of him, the side that still carried remnants of his humanity despite the years of solitude, whispered that he couldn't just stand by. Not when there was a life at stake. Not when the need for connection and compassion had never been more apparent. The bear's gaze softened for just a moment. Robert noticed it, a subtle shift in her posture. She lowered her head slightly, almost as if she were bowing in recognition of his internal struggle. She wasn't just asking for help anymore. She was silently offering him a choice. It was a choice he had never expected to face. The choice was clear: help the bear, or turn his back on her and her cubs, leaving them to fend for themselves in the unforgiving winter cold. For a long moment, Robert simply stood there, battling with himself. The storm outside whipped against the cabin's walls, the wind howling like a wild beast, as though nature itself was eager to see what he would do. His mind flashed back to the years he had spent out here. Years of peace, yes, but also years of isolation. He had purposely distanced himself from the world, never wanting to get involved in the mess of human emotion and connection. But now, here in the midst of this storm, standing before the very essence of life and death, he realized that perhaps he had been wrong all along. He had spent so long thinking that he could survive alone, that he could shut out the world and still find meaning. But what did it all mean if, in the end, you were alone? What was the purpose of living if you didn't have someone, something to care for? The bear's eyes, filled with both fear and a glimmer of hope, stared back at him, waiting. His decision came with a sudden clarity, as if the storm had ceased entirely, as if the universe had aligned to deliver him this moment of profound realization. He had been wrong. There was no survival in isolation. There was only emptiness. The connection, however fragile, however unexpected, was what made life meaningful. It was what had always mattered, whether he realized it or not. Without thinking, Robert opened the door. The gust of wind hit him like a wall, instantly chilling him to the bone. But he pushed through, stepping outside into the snowstorm. The world seemed to blur in the swirling white, but he could make out the figures of the mother bear and her cubs huddled together in the snow, their bodies still and weak. The bear didn't move as he approached, but she watched him with a calm, almost understanding gaze. There was a trust in those eyes, an unspoken plea for him to do something, anything. His heart raced as he approached the cubs. They were so small, so fragile, their little bodies shaking uncontrollably in the cold. The smallest cub, the one that had first caught his attention, was still barely conscious, its tiny form struggling to breathe. Robert could feel his hands trembling as he knelt down, unsure of what to do. He had no medical training, no experience with wildlife rescue. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He gently scooped up the cub, cradling it against his chest, and turned back to the mother bear. "I'll help you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him, or if the words meant anything at all. It was the first time he had spoken in what felt like years. Robert carried the cub inside, and the mother followed, her heavy, cautious steps making the floorboards groan beneath her weight. The bear settled by the door, its wentitat, watching as he placed the cub in front of the fireplace, her gaze never leaving him. The warmth of the fire seemed to revive the small creature, its breathing becoming more steady, its tiny body beginning to regain some color. Robert worked quickly, using blankets and warmth to keep the cub safe, feeling a surge of hope that he hadn't felt in years. His instincts had kicked in, and he was doing what needed to be done. He wasn't just a spectator in this world anymore. He was part of it. As the night wore on, Robert found himself tending to the other cubs as well. One by one, they revived, their tiny bodies slowly warming as the fire crackled in the hearth. The mother bear stood by, silently watching, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the wild world outside. But now, in this small cabin, there was no distinction between man and beast, nature and nurture. In this moment, they were simply creatures of the world, connected by the fragile thread of life and hope. And as the storm continued to rage outside, Robert realized that the world had changed for him in ways he could never have imagined. He was no longer alone, not in the way he once had been. He had chosen to connect, to help, and in doing so, he had found something that transcended all the years of isolation: hope, connection, love, even in the most unexpected places. And as he sat there by the fire, surrounded by the quiet warmth of his new family, Robert realized that perhaps he had been wrong all along. There was no survival in isolation, only in the connections we make, the choices we dare to act on, and the hearts we choose to open. The storm would pass, and in its wake, something beautiful had been born. And that's the incredible story of Robert and his unexpected bond with nature. Sometimes, life has a way of connecting us in the most unthinkable ways, reminding us that even in the wildest storms, there's hope, compassion, and love to be found. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you pause to reflect, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who could use a little hope, and hit that subscribe button for more stories that touch the soul. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can make the biggest difference. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.